Sounds good.
Okay. You ready to go? Okay, so we're going to start in 5 seconds.
9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio, coming to you direct from our super secret studio in the third sub-basement of the Ministry of Snark in Washington, D.C., and from other undisclosed locations across America and around the world.
Hi, I'm David Rothkopf, and as I listen to our intro, I think, once that was kind of funny, this Ministry of Snark stuff. And with every day of passing news, it becomes less and less funny. I'm here, as we typically are on a Thursday afternoon, in the studio at the Comedy Cellar in Greenwich Village, which we are grateful for the use of. And I am with, as we typically are on Thursday afternoons, I'm very glad to say, with Ryan Goodman, who's a professor of law at NYU Law School and is co-editor of the Just Security blog, and who's kind of the brains of at least this part of the conversation. Fortunately, we're augmented in that regard as well by our old friend Ben Wittes, who is the editor-in-chief of the Lawfare blog and who has been immersed in this Trump tornado of news for the past couple of years. Hi, Ben. Welcome.
Hey.
And so, I'm looking across at Ryan, and, he looks, like he has PTSD, something to that effect, because literally this is one of those weeks where every 2 hours there's a new news story. Many of them have a legal subtext. Normally I come in and I've got a perfect story arc in my mind, but really the best I can do today is throw out recent developments and get your reaction to them. And I'm not going to do it in any particular order, if that's okay with you. But let me start with one that is probably the number 4 story of today. And that is that the Office of Special Counsel, which is not the same as Mueller, but is the one that looks into things like the Hatch Act.
It's the other Office of Special Counsel.
Right, which every government needs more than one, and it's... the OSC, exactly. But it came to the conclusion that Kellyanne Conway, an aide to the president, on multiple occasions violated the Hatch Act, which is an act that says that public officials can't do campaigning while they're in their office. They also can't promote products while they're in their office. And Kellyanne Conway does this stuff all the time. And they said, and this is unusual for them, that she should be removed from her office. And almost instantaneously, the deputy White House press secretary responded by saying that she was just exercising her free speech. And, who makes up these crazy laws anyway? Something to that effect. But Ben, I was thinking, because I'm, old, and I remember when I entered Washington shortly before the Andrew Johnson presidency, that Andrew Johnson's impeachment was in part predicated on the fact that he failed to actually enforce laws that the Congress passed. And so, this does, in the midst of, 15 other reasons that there might be an impeachment inquiry, suggest that the White House's ignoring of something like this, which it seems they're going to do, would be an impeachable offense. Now, what's your feeling about all this?
All right. So look, the search for impeachable offenses involves what the military would call a target-rich environment. And I think if the question is objectively, is the tolerance of serial Hatch Act violations by one or more senior White House officials willfully and in the face of findings by the Office of Special Counsel reasonably construable as an impeachable offense by Congress, I'm sure the answer to that is sure. if that's the thing that offends Congress to the point of action in this administration, I have no doubt that members of Congress could, consistent with their oath, vote to impeach on that basis. That said, I think if you are not offended by Volume 2 of the Mueller report, the idea that you're going to be driven to impeach, if you're not offended by the serial calls to prosecute one's political opponents, if you're not offended by declaring career officials guilty of treason who have not been charged, if you're not offended by the attacks on the media, if none of these things get you into the zone of impeachment, the idea that you're going to get there by virtue of a subordinate Hatch Act violation strikes me as faintly fanciful. But that said, look, I mean, in any other administration, this would be a major scandal.
Yeah, well, you listed 4 good causes of impeachment. We could throw in something having to do with working with the Russian government. I want to come back to that. And, of course, there's throwing children into cages and, Puerto Rico.
Oh, I didn't mean to give an exhaustive list. I mean, I was merely mentioning some of the targets that if I were a member of Congress would be among my top candidates. I also think I mean, there's a variety of concerns that a Congress that was actually thinking about how to prioritize presidential misconduct would be focused on. My point is that however you prioritize the most important items, this one would be relatively low on the list.
Okay, well, Ryan, you're entitled to this. Could be Article 8, maybe,
Article 26.
Footnote 45.
Yeah.
Where do you come out on all of this?
I think I agree with everything Ben said, and that in what Ben is saying is to kind of subdivide it into, first, is it actually an impeachable offense? And the answer is very well might be. It could easily fit within the 4 corners because it is a failure to enforce the law. And in fact, the Office of Special Counsel says, given the repeat offenses by Kellyanne Conway, to let her go unpunished is to signal to the entire body of federal employees that this line doesn't matter. So it really is something of that level of significance in the line between where we have had the law to actually police, that nobody steps over it. That said, I don't think it fits within the top 10. And as a political matter, would it gain any support for that? No, but it doesn't mean that we don't and shouldn't reflect on, is this so grave as to actually even rise to the level of something that would be impeachable?
Okay, well, I will make it rise. I'm going to try to tie it to some other things, because I agree with where you guys are with this, but it is part of a pattern of arrogating authority to the executive branch and dismissing the role of the legislative branch, which has the primary authority for actually writing laws. If the executive branch can just say, we're not enforcing that one, it's pretty dismissive. To me, though, Ben, the real big item of the week on that, and of course we have failure to honor congressional subpoenas and or to say, we don't think the Congress has the authority to grant those subpoenas and so forth. We had a court filing earlier in the week in which the White House argued that only the executive branch has the ability to judge the president, that's not the role of the Congress, which, of course, since the executive branch is hired by the president, run by the president, and reports to the president on a regular basis, you suggest that the president could, if he wished to, put himself above the law because there would be no check on him. And, amid all the news of the week, to me, this was one of the most egregious things, because even making this argument is essentially a kind of a coup attempt. And so where does that one figure in your hit parade?
So I'm going to disappoint you on this one. I actually believe almost categorically that the executive branch making a legal argument to a court in the context of a legal proceeding can never be an impeachable offense. And I actually think it is fine for the executive branch to make outrageous legal arguments that should be rejected and we should make fun of. And to me, where the rubber hits the road on this is when the argument is rejected and there is an order to comply with this subpoena. It is an impeachable offense, in my view, to continue to resist past the point at which your arguments have been rejected. But I believe that every criminal defendant is entitled to make any frivolous legal argument they want to make, and I believe the President of the United States is entitled to make frivolous legal arguments, and that the general check against that is A, political ridicule, and B, that they will not prevail. And so to me, the acid test comes not at the point of filing the brief, but at the point at which the poor Solicitor General's office or the poor civil appellate lawyers get their head handed to them by the Second Circuit or the D.C. Circuit. I forget which court this was in. Do you then, and you've exhausted your cert petition, do you then snap to attention and comply, or do you at that point continue to resist?
So Ryan, same question to you, but just to add to it, of course, this is in the context of a thesis that is put forth by the president and some around him, or by some around the president on his behalf, of the unitary executive. And there is not just this legal argument being made, but their behavior is being guided by this. And they do seem to be acting in a way that suggests that this is a much more broadly implemented policy. Now, Ben makes a good point. Court's got to rule on that. And once we get to that, we're at a different kind of a red line in this. But what's your view?
So I think I could maybe get into a difference with Ben on, are there no actions within a courtroom that the president would be actually liable in terms of as an impeachable offense? Like, what if he's filing frivolous suits, or we know for a fact, and it could be proven, let's say he says it on an audio tape, that he's actually making a defense that he knows is completely unconstitutional, but he's doing it only because it will drag out the clock and he can't be impeached in time before the next election. So I'm not sure that there's an empty set there in terms of the activity within a courtroom being immunized in a certain sense, but I do think that if we go down that path, we would lose sight of this bigger picture, which I think we're all talking about as well, this kind of abuse of power. And you could imagine in articles of impeachment across the waterfront ways in which the administration is not allowing Congress to carry out its constitutional duties. That seems to be an abuse of power. And that we have to take into and all the stonewalling, and if they indeed are making arguments that they know can't withhold scrutiny in courts. And this kind of argument and this aggregation of power, especially with the unitary executive theory and an attorney general that thinks that he is subordinate to the president, and that there is only one executive, and that is the president of the United States. Everybody else must lockstep follow suit, and those are the only people that can investigate the president. That's what we're dealing with, and I think that amounts to an abuse of power in the way in which it's being carried out. So I don't think it's a stretch to get there, and even if we don't think about it in terms of impeachable, it's at least identifying the problem.
So Ben,
just to be clear, I think I said almost categorical, and the word almost there was actually meant to describe roughly the category of exceptions that Ryan flagged here. I think you want to create a pretty broad space for legitimate legal arguments to be ventilated, and that includes some less than legitimate legal arguments, allowing some less than legitimate arguments to be ventilated. That said, you could imagine a point at which it's become simply dilatory and not in good faith. And I would probably exhaust, before I treated it as an impeachment matter, I would probably want to exhaust things like sanctions to the lawyers in question for making the arguments, as well as potential contempt issues. Generally speaking, I do want to keep a pretty broad space for, these separation of powers arguments to be argued. That said, I agree with Ryan that it's possible to imagine an extremity of conduct that you simply cannot reconcile with good faith separation of powers disputes.
Okay. And, perhaps in a different kind of a week, we could have a nice, interesting discussion about the unitary executive. But there's just too much going on this week. Last night, we're doing this live and taping it on Thursday. Last night, it was released a conversation between George Stephanopoulos of ABC News and the President of the United States, in which the President of the United States said that if a foreign power offered him information that might be useful in the election against the candidate he was running against, he'd take it. And he wouldn't tell the FBI, because who tells the FBI anything? He certainly has never called the FBI. Of course, within about 30 minutes, the news media gave an example of a time he did actually offer to speak to the FBI back in his casino days. But the bigger issue here was, this was, and many people cited it as such, the equivalent of the 2016 invitation of the Russians to come and, release the emails, give us the emails if you've got them. And, some people suggested, Ryan, sort of collusion 2.0, collusion in plain sight, open season. What'd you think?
I thought it was extremely egregious. And yes, it is a repeat of, Russia, Saudi Arabia, UAE, North Korea, if you're listening. And in a sense,
although he cited Norway, and I wonder what the Norwegians have on him.
Right. Though I think even Stephanopoulos in the question said, like Russia. So it's almost like he would do it again. Stephanopoulos reminded him that the current FBI director, Chris Wray, has said that, of course, you must notify the FBI. And he said and then the President of the United States said, the FBI director is wrong. So, as some have said, imagine if he didn't say it on camera live to Stephanopoulos, but it was a secret audio taping of him in the White House speaking to the campaign legal advisor, or the chair of his campaign, and that's what he said. That would be utterly explosive, except the only difference is he said it publicly and without any shame.
Yeah, and had said it before and did it and followed through on it and defended it and continues to do it and continues to follow through on it. Ben, what was your reaction?
Well, I want to flag a couple things. The first is, when he made that Russia, if you're listening, comment during the 2016 campaign, a lot of respectable people and assumed in good faith that he must be joking. And I remember having I was appalled by that comment. And I wrote something dyspeptic and angry about it the day that he did it.
I can't believe that you would write something dyspeptic and angry.
No, I was furious. I mean, it seemed to me that a major party presidential candidate had called on a foreign intelligence agency to hack his political opponent, which, and I got a lot of response from people who I admire and think highly of, that, come on, you're overreacting. It was clearly a joke. And So I read with great interest in the Mueller report in Volume 1, where Mueller describes what Trump did in that same time frame behind the scenes, which was to order Michael Flynn to launch an effort to recover those emails. This is the 30,000 supposedly missing emails from Hillary Clinton's server. And so, in other words, what the Mueller report showed was that he was very much not joking. He was, in fact, committed to getting Hillary Clinton's emails, and he called on the Russians publicly to release them or to turn them over. And he privately ordered Michael Flynn to figure out how to get them. And Flynn actually, this then prompts a substantial effort on the part of a bunch of people who were associated at the sort of peripheries of the campaign to try to recover these emails, which involved, some pretty disturbing activity. And the reason I remind people of this story is that there's a temptation when you hear Trump talk this way to Stephanopoulos to say, oh, well, he must be joking, or it must be a matter of hyperbole, or, yeah, he says that because he wants to seem unapologetic, but he would never actually do that. And I think it is important to remember that the last time he did something like this, his behind-the-scenes activity was in fact exactly consistent with his public activity. And so I don't know who the rough equivalent of Mike Flynn is right now, but
Rudy Giuliani.
Maybe Rudy Giuliani, maybe, not honestly sure. Is he having some conversation with somebody in which he's doing the private version of that conversation with George Stephanopoulos?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, Ryan. But of course, one of the things that we know is that, in that instance, he followed it up by doing what Ben said. And then there were, scores and scores of instances of interactions with the Russians, and then, denying that, and then embracing the Russians after becoming president and offering them policy quid pro quos for whatever it was that they did, and obstruction and all that. And that's just been an ongoing thing. So another way to look at this is as a continuation of a longstanding policy. I think it's also interesting, though, that, he's been joined in this, as he was then, by the Senate. McConnell objected to, Obama, bringing this public at the time, or driving the investigation further. And in the past few months, we've seen him block funding for efforts to protect us against further interventions. And interestingly, today, in the wake of the president's comment, Senator Warner sought to get a unanimous agreement by the Senate that, people shouldn't take, even though it's already against the law, that people shouldn't take this kind of information. They should, stop this kind of behavior. And Marsha Blackburn, a senator, stood up and objected to it, stop the process in its way. So it's not just the president. It's not just now. It's not just in the open. It's been going on for a long time, and it's involved not just the Mike Flynn's and the Rudy Giuliani's, but in the entirety of the Republican Party.
Yes. The parallels with McConnell in 2016, not wanting to alert the public and stopping or slowing down the alerting of the public until October about the Russian interference, and then McConnell blocking legislation as we speak to protect the public from Russian election interference, I think is similar. I think another thing that's also kind of similar in a sense in the way in which Ben brought us back to the Russia, if you're listening, statement by the president, is that when Trump as candidate made that comment, there were a number of Republicans that came out to repudiate him publicly, but they didn't otherwise necessarily distance themselves from him. And similarly today, Lindsey Graham has said that President Trump's comment to Stephanopoulos was wrong. But that's it. He it just,
Well, Senator Kennedy, John Kennedy, said that he would report it to the FBI, and he's sure the president would too.
Right, covering for him.
You're just saying, he didn't really mean what he said.
Right. So, and even if you can get like Lindsey Graham that far to say something different than the president and critical of the president, he doesn't follow through. So we still don't have him following through in legislation. We don't have him following through as the chair of the Judiciary Committee. So in terms of the disjunction between what people will say publicly and what they'll otherwise do in terms of action, I think it's kind of the flip side of what Ben pointed out, that in fact Trump is more consistent, and what he says he actually does privately. The ugly stuff that he says he follows through on, and then we have the opposite.
Well, Ben, another component of this, of course, is that it has consequences, and that there are governments around the world who hear this and they think, okay, well, we can do more of this. That might be the Russians, it might be others. President hasn't really sort of weighed the calculation that it might be people who oppose him, who might be helping out his opponents in all of this. But it does bring up another point, and which we discuss here almost on a weekly basis with Ryan, who's been very good on this, and you've been very good on this, which is the counterintelligence side of this whole thing, that at the end of the day, there's a national security issue here. And since James Comey left the FBI, the Gang of Eight, and according to Schiff, has not been briefed on what's going on in the counterintelligence. They don't know what's going on in the counterintelligence. We see, activity that might be worrisome. Clearly, FBI Director Wray has said, I wish this information would get passed on to us. So he's, concerned about this. There's every reason to believe there'll be more of this in the future. And yet the national security issue at the center of this thing is kind of the forgotten stepchild of the whole thing, and is not getting followed up on. I'm wondering what your sense is of that.
Well, so first of all, it's important to say that I know absolutely nothing here that isn't public, and but I think there's actually two concerns, and they're distinct. So the first concern is the one that Schiff, that you referred to with respect to Schiff, which is that whatever activity is going on within the FBI on the counterintelligence side with respect to this appears not to have been briefed to Congress in a good long time. The second question, which is a distinct one, I think, is how much activity on this score is going on in the FBI at all. And, for most of the Mueller investigation, everybody, including me, assumed that the Mueller investigation had two components, right? One was a counterintelligence component, and the second was a criminal component. And that both of the sort of major FBI inquiries, which were kind of merged, but had distinct elements in the investigation that that Mueller took over, had been subsumed by Bob Mueller. And that turned out to be wrong. As the Mueller report made clear, Mueller inherited the criminal dimensions. The FBI retained the counterintelligence dimensions. And they set up a pretty interesting and elaborate system that was essentially a one-way channel of information. As the Mueller investigation acquired information that had counterintelligence components, they had a team of FBI agents in their office that was routing that material to the Bureau. And so the question is, whatever happened to the not just how much of it's being briefed to Congress, but whatever happened to the counterintelligence dimensions of this investigation? So here is my concern. If you are an FBI counterintelligence agent, or supervisor, and you watched what happened to Jim Comey and what happened to Andy McCabe and what happened to Pete Strzok and and what happened to Jim Baker and what happened to other FBI counterintelligence officials who were raked over the coals by the Inspector General. How aggressive were you going to be on this score?
Well, and Ryan, in the midst of an investigation that the Attorney General has said he's going to make a priority of investigating the investigators.
Right. And then, as we mentioned a little bit earlier in the conversation, the President of the United States not only just calling these individuals by name to have committed treason, but he said that in response to a reporter saying to him, you know that the crime of treason is punishable by death. Who do you mean? And then he proceeded to name some of the people that Ben just named. So the President of the United States is doing that, and the Attorney General is seemingly carrying out this project. With, we have reporting in the last 24 hours from the New York Times that the Attorney General is not just looking at, for example, the FISA warrant for Carter Page and the origins of the investigation, but is actually going to try to interrogate the CIA's assessment that the Russians interfered to favor Trump. Something that, except for Devin Nunes, I'm not sure anybody else doubts that. Even the Senate Intelligence Committee in a bipartisan report said that the intelligence community's community-wide assessment that the Russians interfered to help Donald Trump was validated as well by Donald Trump's senior intelligence officials. So that's what we're looking at. So when Ben talks about this in terms of a kind of a purging, that's what the investigation of the investigators has become. Then of course that has to be, if people fear for their paycheck or for their careers or their public reputations, they've got to worry about it.
So can I just add something to that?
Yeah, of course.
So last year, a colleague and I litigated to get from the FBI the annual climate survey that they do of all their employees. And this is material that the FBI, to its credit, does a quite detailed evaluation of employee morale on a pretty consistent basis every year. They ask pretty much the same questions. And our hypothesis was that morale would have plummeted in the year that the year after Comey was fired, and Chris Wray had not been especially public or energetic in defending the institution. And so my working hypothesis was that you would see a dramatic change in morale in the Bureau. And that actually turned out to be wrong. The numbers have held up pretty well, at least in 2017. We'll see. We're currently litigating to get this year's numbers, but at least initially, the numbers held up pretty well, except in one area, which is in the counterintelligence space. And if you look at the numbers, we published them all on Lawfare, the numbers really tanked among people who work in counterintelligence. And I think that is a reflection. It's only gotten worse. I mean, I don't know if the numbers have gotten worse, but the atmosphere has only gotten worse since then in exactly the way that Ryan is describing. And I think you can actually see a measurable impact on employee morale at the institution among the people that we ask to do this particular work.
Well, it's no wonder. The President of the United States says he will accept the aid of foreign enemies. He has accepted the aid of foreign enemies. He's defended them. And now he has made that sort of public statement. And at the same time, he has directed the efforts of the Department of Justice away from investigating toward that and to penalizing people for actually trying to protect the United States of America. It's an extraordinary turn of events. And yet, for some reason, the Democratic leadership in the House of Representatives does not see fit to investigate this with this kind of aggression that some people think is called for. through an impeachment hearing. We did a podcast on Monday. I did a one-on-one conversation with Larry Tribe, and he talked about his theory that, let's have an impeachment investigation and then see what should go next, but that this would give this a little bit more heft. Now, the centerpiece of this is based on the theory that some Democrats have that to do an impeachment investigation will turn off some swing voters, and that when election time comes around, they're going to be the critical votes. I have not seen one piece of evidence of any sort that supports this view, but that's the view. And I'll go to each one of you, and what's your take?
So I think that I think one thing that maybe we'll start to distinguish more in these conversations is whether or not there's public support for impeaching Trump versus public support for having an impeachment inquiry. So just this week, the Quinnipiac had one of their polls come out, and one would anticipate, I think it's about a third of the public support impeachment. But then they ask another question. It wasn't perfectly framed, but it was basically trying to get at the question, do you support an impeachment inquiry? And that was a near...
Right, it was framed. How do we have to phrase this question in order for enough of you to support it that we can get something out?
Right. Well, it was about should Congress investigate towards... And that was a near majority. I think it's 48% of the public. So if the public is, in a certain sense, sophisticated, that might even be that we don't think the penalty should come until you have the trial, but we do think you should have the trial and the investigation. This shouldn't go pass by without a serious investigation, with it being an impeachment investigation, that overhanging it. So that is in the polling, and I think that's what would be the stronger question: is does the public support opening the inquiry, and then bring in a certain sense, Larry Tribe and others, and say, where the public stands today is not static in terms of where they will be educated by an impeachment inquiry and the vision of these kinds of hearings in which Hope Hicks will not be able to testify in a closed room, but rather in public, and Don McGahn and others. And then the public might very well shift. I would think that you would think 48% and is actually the low point, and it would only increase over that period of time. It wouldn't decrease. So.
Well, and by the way, the level of support for impeachment is higher now than it was a year before the Nixon impeachment, and the Nixon impeachment resulted in just the kind of shift you're talking about.
Right.
What's your view on this, Ben?
So I am not a political analyst, and I don't purport to have a good read on the likely political effects of impeachment. And I am also not responsible for weighing the right answer against other goods like political damage to Donald Trump. My job, as I see it, is to tell what the right answer is. And the right answer to this one is a super easy question to me. And so, if Nancy Pelosi feels the need with some very good political analysts to weigh that against other prudential and political factors, I don't necessarily begrudge her the need to do it. She's a politician, and that's what politicians do. I do think if there was ever a question, if the question is the right answer that there should be an impeachment inquiry, the answer to that is duh. If the question is how satisfied are you with something less than the right answer, my answer is personally not. But then again, I'm not an elected member of the House, much less a member of the House leadership.
Well, I think we can all unite behind duh as an answer.
I do think it's that there are a lot of hard questions in American constitutional law, and there are a lot of them in the areas that Ryan and I work on that we would disagree about.
Right.
And in fact, the fact that Lawfare and Just Security are two separate sites is actually historically a reflection of that reality. The fact that we're having this conversation. We've been talking for 40 minutes now, and we haven't found anything to disagree about yet, is a reflection of the extremity of the current moment. And, we're not merely in a moments of agreement. We're in a moments of agreement about words like duh.
Yeah. Well, also, you guys are very affable fellows. We've got,
No, but we normally disagree affably.
Right.
No, I understand that. Well, let me shift the focus a little bit, and let me try to do a throwback to another moment where you might have been writing about something. And it's totally off the point of all of these things, and we've only got a couple minutes left, but I would be remiss if I didn't address it, given what my background is and what your background is. And that is, and let me start with Ryan, and then we'll go to Ben. But this week, there has been some activity with regard to Iran. And one of the things that has happened on the Hill is that there have been some arguments made that the authorization to use military force that dates back to the wake of the 9/11 attacks would apply to using military force against Iran. In other words, they would not need another one because of alleged ties, the government asserts, that exist between the government of Iran and Al-Qaeda. Now, that's, pretty dubious assertion, but it's not the most dubious assertion that's been made this week. There were a couple of attacks made on oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman, and Secretary Pompeo came out and said the Iranians did this, and that's bad. And then he left the stage, and he didn't take any questions, and he offered no evidence. Now, we've all lived through the Iraq experience, and I think when you see the, sort of coincidence of events like this, one starts to worry. And I'm just wondering what your reaction is to all that.
Yeah, so I think it's deeply troubling because the idea that Pompeo apparently said to members of Congress in a private setting that Representative Lissa Slotkin just mentioned in the markup of the NDAA is that the 2001 authorization that Congress gave to fight Al-Qaeda and the Taliban somehow has mutated into the situation that it could also justify war with Iran. In other words, the executive branch would not need to go back to Congress for any authorization. They already have it. And they can do with it what they want. They can strike Iran when they want.
It's kind of a brilliant legal argument because, of course, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are in some ways sworn enemies of the Iranians. And if you use this, you will only ever need one authorization to use military force. We can just impute enmities and say, it covers both sides and it will cover everything.
Right. Yeah, I suppose the mistake that Pompeo made is by not saying that the Al-Qaeda was responsible for the oil tankers, because then there would be the daisy chain and it'd have it all. And it is actually, there's that part of it in terms of domestic legal authority is very troubling, and that members of Congress are now voicing that. They have an opportunity to do something about it. In the NDAA, they could pass legislation that says not only, as they've done before, that nothing in the NDAA authorizes the use of force against Iran, but also nothing in any other existing statutory, in any other existing statute authorizes force against Iran. In other words, there might be a context or situation in which force against Iran is legitimate, but then the executive branch has to come to Congress to get that authority. And just to throw out another one that we've had some discussion about this on just security is that Bolton is running his argument about the conditions under which the United States would use force against Iran. And he says it's not just if Iran blows up these tankers, but if Iranian proxies do. And I think that there's a lot of weakness behind that position in terms of international law and the UN Charter, and even who is a proxy or who is controlled by Iran, because there are factual questions about the Houthis in Yemen. So I think both of these kinds of attempts here of setting the table by Pompeo and by Bolton are worrisome in terms of what they have in mind, and as a legal matter are weak.
Do you have a view on this, Ben?
I do. So first of all, I'm not in a position to evaluate the intelligence that Secretary Pompeo put forward on Iranian activity. So I'm going to pass on that. I will say that as to the application of the AUMF to Iran, I think that argument is pretty trivial, with one exception, which is if you were contemplating the use of force against Iran for support of terrorist activity of a type that was, say, Sunni is extremism in a form that is reasonably historically tied to Al Qaeda. I think you could make a plausible argument for it in somewhat the same way that the United States has taken the position that the ISIS campaign is a proper AUMF activity because of ISIS's historic relationship with Al Qaeda in Iraq, which is in turn a derivative of Al Qaeda. That is not the argument being made here, right? The argument being made here is use of force against Iran over some combination of its current state activities and its nuclear program. And these have simply nothing to do with anything the AUMF is about. And I think if you can make this argument, you could really make the argument that any country is covered by the AUMF because it's engaged in some activity that we don't like currently, and we can hypothesize a relationship historically between it and Al Qaeda. And I'm not sure why, for example, Saudi Arabia wouldn't be covered by the AUMF on the same basis. And for that matter, lots of other countries in the region. And so
why stop at countries? It could be the New York Times. After all, if they're the enemy of the people and Al Qaeda was the enemy of the people, we could go further.
Yeah. So look, you can say such things. I'm trying to take the argument a little bit more seriously than that. But look, the argument is bad, and it's. I actually think the better argument would be a pure inherent authority argument, which at least you could then tie in both domestic and international law to some imminent threat that Iran might pose, which, given that it is, a genuinely bad actor that poses all kinds of threats to all kinds of things, is something that you could make out factually, though I don't think I don't think it's a good argument, but I think it's a better. I'd be curious whether Ryan agrees with that. I actually think it's a better argument than the AUMF tie.
I think I think the AUMF tie to be honest, isn't even really an argument. It just doesn't. It really does not work. So, are there some situations in which Article 2 authority, just the president's constitutional power, might allow him for some limited duration to use force against Iran? There could be. And then we're like hostage to the kind of intelligence that we don't have the information for. And we should also, just expand it out one bit, which is the Article 2 power from the president could be in service of protecting collective self-defense of allies. So if Iran attacks a U.S. ally, even in kind of a pinprick strike or a tanker, then the argument starts to get off its feet, and the United States' position is under international law as well, not just domestic law, that you can do this tit for tat, proportionate strike.
Well, don't you, under the War Powers Act, have the ability to take at least short-term action with that?
If it's within the president's Article 2 power, and then that could be justified, just as they justified it with the Syria strikes. So that's more off to the races, and they don't need to justify an all-out war. All they need to do is justify the escalation of hostilities, and then it will take its own path.
Exactly. Here's my prediction for you, David. If we launch any kind of military action against Iran, this will be some iteration of what Ryan just described will be the principal argument, and the AUMF argument will be a kind of secondary throw-in. And by the way, the AUMF lets us do whatever we want. But this is actually a stronger argument than the AUMF thing, and if they decide to proceed with something without going to Congress, they will rely on their strongest argument, not their weakest argument.
Well, it's an important issue, and I hope it's a reminder that not everything has to do with the Trump-Russia case, and not everything has to do with the current scandal in Washington, whatever else that may be, and that, in fact, there are some big issues out there at play in the world. And right now, the situation in the Persian Gulf is worrisome. Worrisome to me, by the way, as a observer of these things, because I can't think of a reason why the Iranians would actually attack these tankers. I can't see of a reason why it's in their interests. And so then the question becomes, in whose interest is it? And why would, what are they trying to produce? And that's quite worrisome if you follow through that logic. In any event, we've come to the end of our time here for the live portion of this broadcast of Deep State Radio. I want to thank Ben for joining us. I want to thank Ryan again for joining us. And for those of you who want to hear other broadcasts or go back and hear the conversation we had with Larry Tribe, which does dovetail into this one, or to get some of the other content on the site, go to the dsrnetwork.com. And while you're there, if you feel compelled to, you could sign up, you could become a member, you could help support all of this. If you don't feel compelled to do that, well, we won't think less of you, but we'll be hurt. Well, it'll hurt us a little bit, sting. But if you're there, try to do that. In any event, we do this 3 times a week. We've got Unredacted, which comes once a week. We've got Washington for Beautiful People, which comes once a week. We've got National Security Magazine, which comes once a week usually. We've been off for a couple of weeks, but we'll be back on again next week. And so come join the other podcasts, go to the website, and we look forward to being with you again very, very soon. Bye-bye. Bye, Ben.
Take it easy. Thanks for having me.
Good to talk with you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.